Hey, what's going on, guys? The Horror Man back with a controversial view of Hannibal. Hannibal is a 2001 horror film, and it's the third movie in the Hannibal Lecter franchise. This sequel was directed by Ridley Scott, and it stars Anthony Hopkins, reprising his role as Hannibal Lecter. Meanwhile, Julianne Moore took over as Clarice Starling. This is the first of a few controversies surrounding the film. Obviously, as I'm sure you all know, Jodie Foster played Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs, and she even won the Oscar for her performance. The interesting thing is, Jodie Foster was actively involved in getting the sequel made. For years, it took no less than 15 drafts to finalize the script. And then, after all that, she ultimately declined to return. She claimed she had been offered more money than ever in her entire career to make the film. But she felt the story betrayed Clarice, which to her had become a real person at that point. Ironically, it also took years for Jodie Foster to fight and ultimately win the role of Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs. It was reported that Anthony Hopkins was furious and even heartbroken that Jodie had declined the offer to return in Hannibal. A lot of people did not like this cast change. They wanted to see Jodie Foster return. In their eyes and minds, Julianne Moore was not Clarice Starling. I think she did a great job, though. They were big shoes to fill. Jodie Foster had won an Academy Award. And the funny thing is, when The Silence of the Lambs was released, no one complained about Anthony Hopkins taking over the role as Hannibal Lecter. Brian Cox was Hannibal first, in Manhunter. I know, most people hadn't seen Manhunter when The Silence of the Lambs was released. And a lot of people probably only saw The Silence of the Lambs because of the praise it was getting and all of the Oscar buzz. My point is, Brian Cox was great as Hannibal Lecter, but no one cared when he did not return for The Silence of the Lambs. Maybe that's why it didn't bother me so much when Julianne Moore took over for Jodie Foster. The next controversy in Hannibal involves the character of Mason Verger, played by Gary Oldman. That role was originally offered to Christopher Reeve, but when he learned more about that character, he turned down the role. Mason Verger is a vile villain, so I do get it. Fortunately, we ended up with a fantastic performance by Gary Oldman. The crimes that character commits is a controversy itself. And the last controversy I want to mention is the biggest of all in Hannibal. Plainly and simply, the ending. Ridley Scott decided not to go with the already infamously controversial ending of the source novel. Thomas Harris, the author of the Hannibal books, wrote a specific ending. It was a bold choice, but truthfully, I really like the ending in the book. And after all, that's what the author intended. But Ridley Scott felt it didn't fit with the Clarice Starling movie adaptation. I personally think it still would have worked and would love to have seen it, but Ridley Scott changed it. The ending we got is still very memorable, but I can understand why viewers felt shortchanged when Hannibal was first released. Those who had read the books were expecting that controversial ending. So when it didn't happen, they were a bit let down. And now, 23 years later, since this movie was released, it's even more understandable. Because despite Hannibal being the third film in the franchise, it's actually the final film in the timeline. Red Dragon would follow this and be a remake of Manhunter. And lastly came Hannibal Rising, which was a prequel. Hannibal is the last we see of Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling. Had Ridley Scott gone with the book ending, we'd have a more final conclusion. Instead, the storyline ends with a bit of ambiguity, and I know a lot of people don't like that. Regardless, Hannibal, in my opinion, is an awesome sequel. I find it to be extremely underrated, and if you're a fan of Manhunter, and especially The Silence of the Lambs, I highly recommend it. Of course, if you disagree, that's fine. After all, Jason and I watched it, so you don't have to. This is just my controversial view. Please be sure to check out Jason's as well to hear his thoughts on Hannibal. Have you seen it? If so, what do you think of it? Comment below and let me know. Which controversial movie will we view next? Check back soon to find out. Until then, remember, physical media matters. Thanks for watching, guys. Hit that thumbs up and be kind. Subscribe.